our cue. Good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce our panel, I want to just turn to Camille Grenier. You want to say a few words, and we're going to watch a short film.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yes? No? There we are. Thank you so much. I'll try to get not too emotional, but when I joined Reporters Without Borders 6 years ago, someone, Christophe Deloire, told me, oh, there is this Athens Democracy Forum hosted with the New York Times. I really want to go. I reached out to Kim and Achilles, only too late. And I tried again in 2020. And I tried again in 2021, and it was always too late. So I finally reached out in January 2022 and finally managed to get Christophe a spot at the Athens Democracy Forum together with Maria Ressa. Sadly, Christophe passed away in June this year, and this is why I'm getting emotional. He's been a true defender of not only journalism, but also democracy, and this is why when we started to plan for not only this session, but also the whole forum with Kim and the team, we thought it would be great to have a very short moment to honor his memory, and thank you so much.
On est venu au plus près qu'on pouvait de ces journalistes qui sont coupés doublement du monde.
We do defend Julian Assange because he is prosecuted for his contribution to journalism.
Pour la sécurité physique des journalistes.
Nous devons absolument faire en sorte que le droit international soit appliqué. Cette action dénommée organe de presse, elle vise à demander la pleine lumière sur l'assassinat du journaliste Jamal Khashoggi.
À la fin, c'est le droit des populations à l'information qui est atteint. C'est ce qui fait la gravité de ces assassinats.
Vote for freedom and democracy. C'est ton père.
Anna Politkovskaya, cette grande journaliste russe qui a payé de sa vie ses enquêtes, son combat pour la vérité.
Il lui était un homme libre, un journaliste libre. Comment imaginer pire attaque alors même que cette rédaction, Charlie Hebdo, a déjà fait l'objet de menaces? Ce concert ne pouvait pas avoir lieu à un autre endroit que Place de la République. Le soir de la tragédie à Charlie Hebdo, des milliers de personnes se sont réunies. C'est insupportable ce niveau d'exaction, de violence contre les journalistes.
Il faut un journalisme indépendant, doté de règles éthiques.
Reporters sans frontières a lancé, avec l'approbation des journalistes e-télé, une pétition.
Je me souviens de ce qui s'est passé à Canal+ et e-télé lors de la prise de contrôle par Vincent Bolloré. Et donc il est important d'être là aujourd'hui pour éviter que l'histoire ne se reproduise.
Nous allons ce soir défendre un journal à un moment de rupture. Nous allons ce soir nous mobiliser pour éviter un nouveau carnage dans une rédaction.
Ils ont assassiné Apple Daily. Reporters sans frontières a lancé ce bus pour le droit à l'information.
Reporters sans frontières lance un bouquet satellitaire afin que la population russe ait accès à des chaînes de radio et de télévision en dehors de toute propagande.
We have despotic regimes which export their propaganda toward democracies. With this project, this is clearly not propaganda against propaganda.
Nous devons aujourd'hui reconstruire un système de principes et de garanties pour l'information et la liberté d'opinion.
Reporters sans frontières, avec des dizaines d'États qui soutiennent, demandent que soit créé à l'ONU, à New York, un poste de représentant spécial auprès du secrétaire général des Nations Unies sur la protection des journalistes.
Il faut aujourd'hui mobiliser les dirigeants des grandes démocraties pour que soit signé un pacte sur l'information et la démocratie.
Il y a des personnes qui me disent, mais est-ce que parfois vous arrivez à obtenir des résultats? Heureusement.
Et Dakar, jusqu'à présent, ouvrait 8 pays. Et là, vous
l'ensemble de l'Afrique subsaharienne. Nous avons un mot d'ordre interne qui est que ça n'est pas parce qu'on tente de sauver le monde qu'on doit passer une mauvaise journée.
Alors, on va lever un toast. Ceux qui veulent lever un toast à Vincent Bolloré lui-même peuvent le faire. Ici règne la liberté. À la liberté de la presse.
Il faut que je le mette où là? Comme ça? Tu vas les découvrir. You want to actively support Julian Assange? Drink Café Nero.
I'm going to go from one very sad moment to another grim subject, which is the crisis of confidence in journalism. When I was thinking about this panel, you have the titles up here, and about who was going to be on the panel, I thought, okay, we have one person who's educating the next generation of journalists, aspiring journalists, maybe an aspiring journalist, someone who's trying to protect journalists, and someone who's trying to enable the financial future of journalism. So a broad perspective, a range of perspectives here. And two of us from what Farah earlier called the mainstream media, or the MSM, which I feel like is a kind of fraught acronym. But we are at very fraught times for journalism. People are not reading journalism. They don't believe journalists, and they don't want to pay for journalism. So these are three not small problems facing journalism. But one thing that journalists do like to do is talk about journalism, especially when they can complain about it. So with that, and with those three big problems, I just ask each of you how you see the future of journalism, given those, enormous, perhaps insurmountable threats to its existence.
Well, obviously, I mean, I have to, exude positivity, especially given that we've got some 2,500 students at the Cronkite School at Arizona State, and they come to us. A large part of them come to us for an education in journalism, and also a commitment to it. I remain, despite the, dramatic changes that's happened, in the industry from an economic standpoint, I remain very positive and bullish on the future of journalism. We still need it very much, in our communities, from a global perspective. It's very much a part of, a healthy democracy. And I'm encouraged by the students who I get to interact with on a day-to-day basis at the Cronkite School. I'm encouraged by, the other educators, also encouraged by the people who are practicing journalism on a daily basis, and their commitment to this, despite the tremendous financial headwinds and some of the other factors that you pointed out. But it's clear that there is still a need for journalism in our society to inform the public, to help to bring people together, to help to solve, some of our most pressing issues. And so, again, I think that there's definitely signs of a path forward in terms of alternative funding models, from nonprofit journalism funding models to other ways that we can help to pay for this. But we're just in a time of transition, is the way that I'd like to say it. This is not the end, and I think that we will look back on this period as a period of transition for this discipline.
All right, Persiana, perhaps you can talk about the future and what you see as an aspiring journalist.
Yeah, so I'm representing the International Youth Think Tank as a youth fellow. So I'm very happy to bring this young perspective to this important discussion today, because I think it's not a surprise for everyone sitting in this room that young people distrust media. And that's an issue that we see rising more and more. There are many reasons for that. There are, for example, fake news, misinformation, spread of all of these things that let young people avoid media. But what we have done as International Youth Think Tank members is to really dive deeper into understanding a bit more what does it make us distrust the media. And I can bring some insights and some policy proposals that we have collected in the past couple of months. For example, in the International Youth Conference in South Africa that you heard of today from Bia, that was one of the main discussion points. And people really discussed, okay, what are these factors that make us in such a big distrust in media? And one of the things that they have identified is that media is lacking diversity. Not only diversity in terms of representation of sexual differences, racial, gender, disability, and so on, but really also diversity in terms of content, in terms of representing different perspectives and different views. And another challenge is also the ownership. Because young people are saying if there are several very, very strong entities, for example, that control most of the media, how are we actually getting the unbiased picture? Another big issue we just saw on the video, right? It's something that we have really dove into because it's a very important topic, the protection of journalists. And I also have a personal example for this in my home country, in Bulgaria, where 6 years ago, the whole country woke up to the news that one of our leading investigation journalists was murdered very brutally on her peaceful jog in the park. Imagine that, just 3 days after uncovering very sensitive information about corruption. And I will never forget exactly the same feeling that I was feeling while I was watching this movie again, the whole chills all around my body, where I was just thinking, how can we really sustain truth if people are being killed for standing up for it? So this is also something that we think definitely needs to be looked at. And it's also not a surprise that a lot of young people are turning to social media nowadays. They're getting their news there, their information there. However, that also possesses a lot of risks because the algorithms on social media create the so-called echo chambers, filter bubbles, that really influence the way that we see things and the political beliefs that we have. And that was also a very exciting issue that was investigated by other youth fellows last week in Oslo, where in collaboration with the Nobel Peace Center, we actually interviewed people on the streets, Norwegians, and asked them different questions about democracy, but also asked them, do you think that algorithms on social media are influencing your political views? And also, have you ever ended a relationship because of very radically different political views? I think it's not a surprise that the first question, the majority of people said, yes, we recognize that algorithms have a huge influence on the way I build my political beliefs. But what was personally for me very interesting was also that the majority of the people have admitted that they have opted out of a relationship due to very big differences in their political views. So for me, that's super inspiring to see what kind of different perspectives we have. And if you're really interested into this, follow our page because we're going to post a bit more insights about this. But as you said, a lot of people are complaining about the issues, and also young people have the tendency to speak up and complain about a lot of things. But this is not who we are. We also want to bring some things to the table, not only say, oh, I don't like this, I don't like this. And therefore, today I have two proposals in my hands that I would also like to give to you. The first proposal was actually developed at this International Youth Conference in South Africa, where people have built this idea of creating a global media guild that really controls and regulates the media globally in terms of diversity, to really track how diverse are different media outlets through, for example, the Media Inclusivity Index, we can call that, but also track the ownership. Because we do believe that we need to implement very strict caps on ownership so that there are no few entities that hold very big market share, and it's therefore very important that we prevent monopolies. The second proposal that I have is tackling the political and the journalistic community, because it's a very close topic to my heart. I got very emotional looking at the video, so we have really investigated this topic very much, and we think that the journalists are the key actors in sustaining democracy, but they can only do so if we support them and if we give them the protection that they need. So what we propose is that we engage the United Nations, that we create a global agency that really tackles journalistic community. And I know that you might say, oh, that's such a, idealistic, far-fetched proposal, but hear me out. The United Nations are investing so much into peacekeeping. They're sending military troops, really putting so many resources into peacekeeping. Why don't we do that for truth-keeping as well? Why don't we sustain truth by really protecting the ones that deliver it to us in their lives? So these are our proposals. I would really like to give them to you, just to pass them. Everyone else can obviously find them on our webpage. But one message is clear. Young people will start believing media if we really build institutions that deliver truth, that deliver transparency, and also that protect the people that do that as a daily action every day. So, sorry. Yes.
I just want to take a moment and say this is why I'm hopeful for the future of journalism, because of the work that you're doing. So I want to commend you on that, and that's why I'm positive. So it takes work that you're doing with your organization and others doing the same. I think that we can create some positive momentum.
Thank you so much, in the name of the whole organization.
So in terms of protecting journalists, obviously there were maybe a few bright spots this year. The return of Evan Gershowitz of the Wall Street Journal from imprisonment in Russia. But for the most part, it's been a very grim year with a huge number of journalists killed while reporting. Camille, do you want to talk a little bit about those challenges?
Yes, we see, we're not getting in the right direction when we look at press freedom. The space where journalists, if you look at it globally, the space where journalists can do their work really freely with no pressure is not increasing, it's rather shrinking throughout the world. But I just wanted to get back to your question on what is the future of journalism. Christophe would have said, I don't know how it looks like, but what I'm convinced of is that the social function of journalism will remain no matter what. And this social function is to provide facts, and I'm not sure if it's truth. I would say facts rather than truth. We've seen how truth can be different from one place to another. But bring facts and context and let then people decide enlightened by these facts and context. And to preserve this social function, a few years ago in 2021, we launched one of our landmark reports calling for a new deal for journalism, in a sense where we need all stakeholders and all those who can support the sustainability of journalism and of the ideal of journalism to really take action. The first, we have basically three buckets of action. The first is indeed getting back to what Persiana was saying is around press freedom. And we need to ensure that journalists are able to do their work freely, independently, pluralistically in a way. The second is around public intervention, and we need better, stronger, future-proof policies to ensure the financial sustainability of journalism. We've seen in some countries some examples of what we call the bargaining codes on how we share the values. We'll have to assess how this is exactly working, but we can see that these sort of mechanisms are inspiring around the world, notably in global majority countries. And the last bucket, but we already had a lot of discussions on AI this morning, so I don't want to put another layer of that, but it's making sure that we have an enabling environment for journalism and news media to innovate, to create value, and to be sustainable. Back in 2021, ChatGPT was not there yet, but we called for this sort of organize the global discussions around AI and journalism, or AI and information integrity. And now we see that this discussion is still taking shape. And I think that getting to these three buckets of interventions we should be able to preserve journalism from what is, and some have called an extinction era of journalism, notably after the pandemic, which we saw had a terrible impact, notably in some markets. But tomorrow you will hear from Nishant Lalwani from the International Fund for Public Interest Media, who can tell you way more about all this. Thank you.
First of all, I think I'm right in saying today is the 6th anniversary of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. So I would like to thank you for reminding us about how perilous doing journalism is today, and it's becoming more perilous. When I thought about your question for a minute, I immediately started thinking through the lens of the New York Times. And if you look at through the lens of the New York Times, we're doing okay. And actually, if you then step back a bit, if you look at through the lens of New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Financial Times, The Economist, we collectively have about 20 million, slightly under 20 million subscribers, of which the New York Times has half of that, a bit more than half of that. If you think about that in a global context, that's pretty worrying. It's a pretty small number. In other words, the real crisis isn't with news organizations like the New York Times that are appealing to a rich, well-educated audience. It's below that level. The crisis is with local journalism, where there are, and this is reported in your excellent report, by the way, that there are deserts of journalism. More journalists have lost their jobs in the United States than coal miners since the beginning of this century. So why does that matter? I would argue, and in the piece in the back of the section today, Athens Democracy Forum session, which I think is very good, which is focusing on this topic, Dean Baquet, the former editor of the New York Times, who's doing a lot of work helping local investigative reporting, points out that local issues are national issues. If you really want to understand what's happening on a national scale, you have to understand what's happening on a local scale. And right now, there are no journalists going into town halls, procurement meetings. No one's holding people to account, which is not healthy for democracy. So if we believe that journalism is a core ingredient for a functioning, healthy democracy, which I do passionately, we need to think about new models that will support that journalism. And this goes exactly to this report. And there is a sort of smorgasbord of different possibilities around how we do that. I think that I'm not going to be an expert on any of these possibilities. I think they all need to be debated. But if we just take the media, the social media platforms for a minute, if you look at Apple, Google, Meta, Alphabet and Meta together, I think if we were just, I don't think anybody's going to do this, but if we were to tax them 1% of their revenue, that would give, at least on last year's revenue, about $8 billion of revenue, which would be a good start to help nourish local journalism. So that is, I'm throwing that out there. There are a number of different ideas that need to be engaged, but it needs to be done at a political level, because if it isn't, we are facing an existential crisis, which will harm democracy. And by the way, that will harm institutions like the New York Times. We also need a thriving democracy.
The issue of trust, I think, is tied into the question of what is journalism, right? Because if you're talking about young people getting their news on social media, there's no way to verify, the source, whether it's, just someone randomly tweeting something, whether it's someone in Russia pretending to be posting something as someone else, whether it's an institution with any kind of standards. And even within journalism, there is a lot of debate about what is journalism, why should we trust it? In this video, for example, you have Julian Assange, who most American journalists would not consider to be a journalist, and you have a confusion as to what is opinion journalism, what is news journalism, what is advocacy journalism or activism rather than journalism. And I'm wondering, maybe you can talk about this, Persiana, a bit specifically, more specifically, what young people think of as journalism, and how do we sort of, part of what the New York Times has tried to do is to educate people about just what our process is and what conflicts of interest mean and what it means to be fact-checked. I don't know if those values are understood by most young media consumers and whether that's important to them.
Yeah, that's a very interesting issue, and I've already mentioned this in different conversations before, that you mostly trust people that look similar than you, right? So that's why young people relate more to, for example, social media content creators. They rather turn to this side of the story because they use more accessible language. They understand everything that is being somehow transmitted to them, which is also not correct because, as you said, there are algorithms that influence all of this. There are missing sources. There is a lot of misinformation going around, but people choose to still believe into that. And that's why I think that this education in that matter is very, very important, to find a middle ground on how to create, be it article, for example, that is widely understood by everyone, that really portrays plausible information that people can trust. I don't think that the media, the way that it is right now, if it doesn't evolve and doesn't, match the new trends and the new requirements of young people, will get to them. So I think it's work on both sides to find this middle ground for everyone to be on the same page in the end.
If I may, I just want to propose a couple of maybe radical things to think about. Number one is that journalism really should be taught as part of a K through 12 curriculum, that understanding the importance of journalism to a functioning democracy. That should be part of what students learn, just to build that appreciation of information and news and how that affects their daily lives. Secondly, if you were to build a community from the ground up, you would want a few important things. Number one, you would want to have clean water. You would want to have the ability to treat wastewater. You would want, obviously, electricity. You would want access to the internet. You would want public safety. But I would also argue that journalism, effective local journalism, should be seen as an important part of the infrastructure of the community. And it should be something that people should actually be encouraged to pay for. And that it should be somehow perhaps regulated or overseen from a local perspective. Now, I know that's radical, but again, I believe very strongly that it is part of the infrastructure of a healthy community, and it is as important as all of the other factors that I pointed out: public safety, water, and internet access. We need access to good, effective local journalism.
I mean, I don't know the extent to which people in this audience are familiar with the challenges to local journalism in the United States, and it's probably different in other countries, but in the US you have radio, local radio, which is now often owned by a corporate organization that basically creates things, centralized things, that's then sent out to local stations. It's not actually coming from the community. Similar things are happening with local television, which used to, again, really reflect the community, and with local newspapers. And Albany, for example, I was in Albany, and this was now about 5 years ago, and reporters there for the local paper, which is 1/12 of its former size, were saying that they used to have about 50 journalists who would be reporting on the State House in Albany about what was going on there now. And at this point, I think there's maybe 2 or 3 people there, and not necessarily full time. And what you end up having is no one reporting on local politics, the local State House. But then furthermore, the idea that the community has no real tie to its institutions. They have no one holding their own community members to account. And running out of time already. So I put that question to you. I mean, how do you see local journalism, which we all know is really important, actually functioning, actually reviving, because there's no money for it as it stands right now. There's no structure for it.
Well, I don't want to take up too much time, but obviously one of the things that I think higher education, we train journalists at our school. I think higher education can play a role in helping to fill news deserts, whereas students are out in the community covering news and filling the spaces where local journalism has receded, helping to cover some of these news deserts. I think that that's a tremendous opportunity for us to address the need while we look for additional alternative funding models. But I'll toss it to some of the others to get their opinion.
Someone come up with a magical solution.
No, I'm lucky because in France we do have a lot of local news media still, as long as it lasts. Very quickly on the question of trust, you may have seen in the video that we ran a bus over France for months, and really to go out there. And in your earlier remarks, you said people don't pay, don't trust, and don't read, but they do expect a lot from journalism. They do expect a lot on transparency, on the transparency of ownership, notably, on objectivity. They have a really high level of expectation for journalism because they know they need it somehow. And the second thing, when it comes to social media and platforms, what has changed with social networks and the disruption of the distribution side of news is that something that never happened, journalism being in direct competition with all types of content. And it goes from choreography on TikToks to memes to anytime to Russian propaganda. And it's how we find mechanisms to, in this whole disinformation discussion, you have two possibilities or two options. Either you try to take down the bad, which is very hard and has some risk for freedom of expression, or you try to promote what could be qualified as trustworthy journalism. RSF has done a lot of work on that. There is the Journalism Trust Initiative with a certification mechanism, which is proving quite helpful. And Microsoft, because they're in the room, has been using this mechanism to really promote trustworthy and give this sort of comparative advantage back to trustworthy journalism.
I want to bring up one other challenge on the profitability question. So it used to be in the news that the news profession, the business, sustained itself through an advertising model. And the conflict of interest that people would perceive would be between the advertisers perhaps having an undue influence on the journalism. So, for example, if you were writing for a magazine and there were luxury perfume ads, could you also then have reporting in the newspaper that talked about the toxicity of certain, organic compounds in the perfumes? That was the big challenge. Now the challenge is with a subscriber-based model, you would think, okay, well, it's people paying to see the news, so perhaps that's more honest. But on the other hand, you have new challenges, which is that you are essentially writing for your reader. And so if you are writing for your reader, there's then the idea that you might go towards clickbait, or you might only write about subjects in which there's high interest, but not cover other areas which may be very important to democracy, to the world, but doesn't necessarily attract a lot of eyeballs, but we think of as important. And I'm curious, and maybe Stephen, you can address this specifically, how you think about that challenge.
Well, I think there is a dire need to do public service journalism. I mean, if you look at what's happening right now in the Horn of Africa, for example, unbelievably unreported what's happening there right now. Why? Because media organizations simply don't have the resources to send there. And when they do cover it, frankly, often it's not of high interest to readers. Should we still be doing that? Yes, we should still be doing it. So the question is, how do we still do that? Well, we need to find new funding models. So, and again, the report of the New Deal for Journalism, I think, does suggest quite a lot of very interesting models. Some of them already exist. The BBC, I would posit as an example of a public service organization that does enormous amounts of good. Is it without fault? Certainly not. But overall, it's trusted, generally trusted, and it's paid by the license fee. So I think there are ways to do this. but we need to do it in a way that is very well thought through and desperately avoids news capture from bad actors, political actors, which is a real threat. I think in terms of engaging young people, I think news organizations such as ours can do and should do, and in our case I think we are doing more to explain the impact of our journalism, why it matters, give real examples of the cause and effect of their journalism. So when we did a piece on looking at international lawlessness on the high seas and focused in on slavery on Thai fishing ships, where Rohingya people were literally chained to and those ships were fishing for stuff which ended up in pet food in America. When that story came out, the pet food companies stopped sourcing their materials from Thailand. So that's an example, but we need to be much better at explaining why our journalism matters to young people.
I think that we're going to see, though, the age of there being, taking the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal out of the picture, but it's really focusing on local journalism. The age of having these multi-layered, enterprises where you had assistant managing editors, deputy managing editors, those days are over. The future will be flat organizations where you have more people connected to the community and out on the street rather than people doing work in the offices. And I think that that's really where journalism, I say, probably went wrong. Leaning heavily on the advertising model and then becoming these multi-tiered organizations. And the further you went up, the further you got away from being on the street and really practicing journalism. The future of this is really flat organizations, again, where people are part of the communities, they're connected to the communities, they have relationships with people in the communities, much like we would expect out of effective community policing, is the same as where I see the model for journalism going into the future.
Before we close this out, I want to ask 3 quick questions of the audience with just a show of hands for each of these questions. How many of you read the news at least once a week, not every day? And how many of you have a local news organization, let's say a newspaper, in your hometown? And how many, now hands down, how many of you pay for the news? All right, well, we have a very nice audience then. That's at least a reassuring, happy note on which to end this panel. Thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you. Sorry we didn't have time for questions. We're going to have a quick word from our teens in the audience before our next discussion. Audience? If one of our teen representatives, there you are with the microphone, go ahead.
Hello. I wanted to ask you whether there are institutions that intervene in the process of covering the truth and reveal the truth that is hidden between words of vague evaluations. Should we establish a kind of observatory for cases like this?
Does anyone want to take her question? Do you want to repeat your question, actually?
Right.
Thank you.
Are there institutions that intervene in the process of covering the truth and reveal the truth that is hidden between the words of vague evaluations? Should we establish a kind of observatory for cases like this?
Does anyone want to take that?
Yeah.
Observatory for the truth, is that so? An independent body that's sort of overseeing truth.
Yeah.
I mean, again, the BBC is regulated by an organization.
Right.
So there are examples of that.
Right, but of course, the question is, who is the regulator, right?
Yeah.
Because you could say the same thing in Russia. They're overseeing the Russian state media, but do we trust Russia to be the government there?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that one of the things, and goes a little bit to your last comment, Dr. Blair, but I think I agree with the thesis of flattening up to a point, because I do think you need those checks and balances, which is basically we call editing and sub-editing, are really important for organizations, because a journalist is out there doing her work or his work, and they're doing it as rigorously as possible, but there are always gaps. And if having an editor sitting there saying, what about this, what about that, if you've thought about this, let's go around that again, I want you to go back on another point, I think is really important.
I agree with that. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I could also see, if there could be some sort of community board that sort of regulated, or sort of tracked information and really called out misinformation for what it is, and really helped to break the chain of misinformation and disinformation in communities. I think that would be something that would be an effective model that could perhaps be replicated in many different places.
See, I'm always distrusting of whoever is on the board. But another question from one of the teens in our audience. Yes.
I have a great passion for staying informed about current events, about what's going on in the world by reading the news. However, so many young people, including so many of my friends, seem to be disconnected from the news, as events across Europe and beyond leave them feeling somewhat powerless. How can we redefine journalism to not only engage the younger generation, but also empower them to make a difference? And what exactly does that look like?
Anyone want to take on that question?
You should.
You're a youth representative up here.
Yeah. I think we already touched upon a lot of points to that, right? I think it's about making it relevant, about making it engaging. It's about showing and educating also people how to read it, how to understand it more. I don't know if you would like to add something.
Well, I do have an example of around climate journalism, for example, because I do think that's an area that young people are particularly engaged in and concerned with for very obvious reasons. So we do quite a lot of live events around climate journalism at the New York Times, and increasingly try and seek out, as we're setting the agenda for the programming of these things, we really make an effort to go out to, we created a community of young people, we call it Generation Climate, who we asked to inform the programming. And the programming is really around climate solutions as opposed to the dystopian nature of the crisis. And what we found is that, and we have a bias towards young people from the global south because they're so often unrepresented, and we found that they are incredibly useful at helping inform our programming to make it more relevant. But more to the point, it's also encouraged us to make sure that young people are represented on the stage and during these events that we do, which has been very enriching to the whole basis. And I think hopefully that will then mean young people are more engaged and more trusting of our content. And then there's other things we need to do, like use of visual journalism, audio, graphics, in order to use the digital technology in order to make the journalism more impactful for young people on the platforms in which they're reading, Instagram, TikTok, etc.
Absolutely. Do we have time for one more teen question? We don't. All right. Thank you so much to the young people in our audience for contributing. We are going to move on to our next discussion, which is with Meredith Whitaker of Signal. Thank you, all of you, again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.